Hi, this is Jen, and thanks for joining me today. Today I am going to be doing a video on inks and what they are and what they're used for, and as well some different brands. I started researching inks probably around June. And when I first started, I was very overwhelmed, and so I kind of didn't work on it a whole lot. And then a couple weeks ago, I wanted to just get it finished up. It's a project I wanted to get done. And so I went ahead and got this chart compiled. This chart has a lot of inks. It's divided by the type of ink. So, for example, dye inks, pigment inks, the hybrid inks, embossing inks, and the solvent inks. And then there are columns for whether they're alcohol friendly or water friendly or archival. I only marked those sections yes or no if the website for that ink. So I went to the websites of the manufacturers. So, for example, Ranger, Catherine Pooler, and that is where I got the information from for this spreadsheet. So I have the ink name, the brand, the price, the number of colors in that range, and there's notes for some of them, and whether you can use them with alcohol markers or water, or if they're archival. So as a little bit of history, when I started card making, I used the black ink. So I used the VersaFine and the Memento. I was never really sure what to use with water or what to use with alcohol markers. And at that time, I didn't do a lot of coloring. I still don't do a lot of coloring with alcohol markers. So it wasn't a big deal to me. But what I ended up doing was when I started card making, I bought a set of close to my heart inks from somebody, and they were used and they were not that juicy. And so those were the only colored inks I have, and I didn't use them hardly ever. And then from that point, I would just buy like one or two of one brand and one or two of another brand. And I just, organizational wise, it was frustrating for me. And I didn't like that I had like one red and one pink and one green, and I didn't have the variation of color. And then when I started seeing the layered stamping, like the stamping layers for the flowers and that, I was like, well, I would really like to have brands of inks. So at that time, I sat down and I forced myself to learn the different types of inks and what I needed to use them for. And this was probably only 6 months ago. Like, it took me that long to finally say, enough is enough. I'm going to learn what these are so that I'm only buying these brands that I like and not buying one or two here and there, because new inks come out all the time. So for example, the spreadsheet that I created, the newest ink that I have in there is the Pink Fresh Studio line, which just came out last week. And so I've included that in. And by the way, if you find anything that you think is incorrect in the spreadsheet, or there is a brand that's missing, please feel free to either comment or send me an email, and I'd be happy to update the spreadsheet. This is a Google Doc, so you don't have to purchase anything. You just click on the link and it'll pull it up, so you can print it out or save it to your computer, whatever you want to do with it. So what I did when I, probably about 6 months ago, when I started actually purchasing groups of ink of one brand, I went ahead and I found ones that I liked, and I purchased those, and I knew that I wanted a pigment ink and a dye ink specifically. I had already had the distress inks and the oxides, of course, but other than that, I got rid of all my other inks, and purchased the brands that I liked, the colors. And then I ended up getting several others. The most recent is a Catherine Pooler, and for me, I'm done with inks now. I think there's always going to be another ink and another. So unless they have some different formulation that does something crazy, I am happy with what I have, especially buying the Catherine Pooler line. There are so many colors, and they're just beautiful. And so I'm very content with what I have. So the inks that I show you for samples in this video are my inks. I didn't purchase additional. As you can see when you look at this list, there are a ton, and so I did not want to sit here and you know, break my bank and then have these extra single inks laying around. I guess I could have given them away, but so if I could go back and tell my new card maker self that what inks to buy, I would say to definitely buy a pigment ink in black and a dye ink in black. And then you can build on the colors of whatever brand you choose to purchase inks from. I think that's a great way to get started. And I hope that with this video, you can kind of figure out what each ink does and what inks you like. So the spreadsheet lists a lot, like I said. So it's just personal opinion on what you are gonna want. The color range, the palette, whether you like the palette and the brand and the company and all of that. So the first inks are the dye inks, and dye inks you have the largest selection as far as brands go. Just about every brand has a dye ink, so you have a huge selection of dye inks. Here are the dye inks that I have. So that includes Memento in black, although Memento does come in lots of other colors. I believe there are 30 colors of Memento. This is, again, Tuxedo Black. The next one that I have is Wendy Vecchi, a Make Art blendable dye ink. And then I have also the Kaisercraft. I don't know why I got those. And then the Catherine Pooler, which are my favorite. Also included as a dye ink are the distress inks, and I did not realize until I started researching that a distress ink is actually a dye ink. So it has the properties of a dye ink. And some of the properties of the dye inks are the quick to dry. They're not waterproof. They absorb into the paper. They're alcohol marker friendly. And the color is generally lighter when you stamp it than it is on the ink pad. And of course, whenever you're buying an ink, always look at the box or the container and make sure that it has all these properties if that's what you're looking for. The next type of inks are pigment inks. And the pigment inks that I have are basically the VersaFine and the VersaFine Clair. Pigment inks are, at least the VersaFine and the VersaFine Clair are great detail inks, and they are great full coverage inks. So that's why I love them. And pigment inks are going to be your metallics, your whites in most cases, so your antique colors. Some of the properties are they're slow to dry, so they're great for embossing. They're waterproof. They sit on top of the paper. They're generally not alcohol marker friendly, and the color that you see on the ink pad is the color that it's going to stamp. So next is hybrid inks, and I only have one, and that's a distress oxide. There are several others, and more keep coming out. A hybrid ink is basically, means a combination of two elements. So a hybrid ink is a combination of a pigment ink and a dye ink. So they have properties of both. And depending on the type or the brand of hybrid ink, the properties can be different. So if you're buying hybrid inks and you are looking for certain things, just look at what the properties are for that particular type of ink, because they can differ because they are hybrids. And then we have embossing inks, which probably most of us know. Embossing inks are made for embossing, so embossing powders. I have the Versamark and the Versamark Dazzle, though there are lots of other brands that do carry embossing inks. Embossing inks are great because they are very slow to dry, so it could take up to 5 minutes for an embossing ink to dry, which gives you plenty of time if you're doing multiple images to emboss those. So in this portion of the video, I'm going to go ahead and take the inks and kind of put them through a little test. So I'm going to test them with an alcohol marker as well as a Tombow marker, and then I will spritz the images with water to see how they react. If you remember, a dye ink, one of the properties is that it's fast drying and also that it is not waterproof. But as far as the alcohol markers, this is one of the things that has always confused me. So I'm really glad I did this test. I started out with a pink alcohol marker and then switched over to a lighter color just because if there's going to be any effect, it's probably going to be a lot easier to see on a yellow. So as you can see, the Kaiser ink, which is a Kaisercraft dye ink, did not have any effect on that. It did not have any effect on the Catherine Pooler as well. And then the Wendy Vecchi, no effect, no smudging of the ink, no lightening of the ink. And so next is the Distress ink. And again, it did not have any effect on that. And then the Memento, which I'm not surprised because that's what I usually use to do alcohol marker coloring on the very few occasions that I do. And so it didn't have any effect at all on any of the dye inks. So I would say in general, for me, it takes a lot of confusion out of it. Probably I would say pretty confidently that any dye ink is going to, or I want to say any because I don't know that, but most dye inks I'm going to say are going to be okay for alcohol markers. And then I'm going to go ahead and take this Tombow marker, which is a water-based marker. And I apologize for not being in frame here. So I'm just going to color over a little bit, and it does, because it's a water-based marker, it does have an effect on the ink. It's not really noticeable on the Kaiser ink, but on the Catherine Pooler ink, it does smudge the ink out. And changes the image from what it had originally been stamped as. And it's not super noticeable on the other inks as well, but the Memento, you can see it darkens up a lot and kind of the color bleeds a little bit out. And it's probably because the Tombow is a water-based marker. But again, it does not, it's not a horrible effect, but it's an effect that you probably don't want when you're stamping up your image. So I would say it's probably best not to use water-based markers with your dye inks. And then the next test that I'm going to do is going to be with my water spritz bottle. And I'm just going to spritz each of the images a few times. So I guess the moral of the story is that you don't want to use a dye ink if you do not want the watercolor effect and you don't want the ink to run or react to the water, because it will react to water. I know for me, one of the things I loved about the Distress inks and about the Catherine Pooler inks is that it does react to water, because you can get some really super cool effects. But you probably would want these, if you got a light enough color of ink, would work really well with no line watercoloring. But a darker color would not work so well. So it just depends on what project you're working on and what kind of effect you're going for. But again, the dye inks are not waterproof, so they will react to water. Some of these reacted a little more than others, but they all reacted in some way. You can see the words, you can't really read what they say on some of them because the water has blurred those and moved that ink around on the paper. The last test that I do with the dye inks is I've gone ahead and swatched out all of the inks using a blender, and I'm just going to see if there's a difference in how they react to the water droplets. So I know the Distress inks are like kind of, I don't know if you could say they're famous for that, but for reacting to water. And so I was just kind of interested to see if all the dye inks would react the same to water, to give those little water splotches. And they pretty much do, except for the black. The black doesn't really pick up too much. It does leave some water marks, but the ink does not pick up too much on that Memento black ink. But all the others do. The Distress ink is probably better at it than the others, because as you can see, the others you can't really see right off the bat that ink is pulling up when you put the paper towel on it. But the Distress ink is one that you can tell immediately that the color has been lifted with the paper towel. So I spritzed it first, and then I went and took my water brush to see if I can get a little more water on some of these to see if it gives a better impression, I guess. So they all kind of react in a way to the water. It's just that the distress ink does react a little bit better or give that cool effect where the ink is kind of picked up. So like you said, the black doesn't really do anything but leave a mark of water, but the Kaisercraft ink actually did pretty good with picking it up, as did the Catherine Pooler and the Wendy Vecchi. They all picked up water with the paper towel, or picked up color with the paper towel, but again, the Distress Oxide performed the best on this test. So next I'm going to test out the Pigment Inks and the Archival inks. So the only two Pigment Inks are by the same brand, which is Imagine Crafts / Tuscanito. I don't know how to say that. So one of them is the VersaFine Black Onyx, and one of them is the VersaFine Clair line. And this is the alcohol marker, and as you can see, excuse me, as you can see, that ink does not stay in place when the alcohol marker goes over it. It smears it quite a bit. The color didn't do as bad, but it still kind of wicks out a little bit. So since I only have two pigment inks, I can't say whether the others will react the same, but I would say in general, and what I've researched and read, is that a pigment ink is not going to do great with an alcohol marker. So this is the Archival ink, and it doesn't wick the color out, but it does definitely lighten the ink. So the alcohol marker on an Archival ink does not do... the ink doesn't hold up to the alcohol marker, I guess, because as you can see, it changes the color of the ink, and so you probably are not going to want that. And so I would say probably just stay away with alcohol markers and Archival ink. And again, I apologize, I didn't realize that I was not in frame here. I'm just taking the Tombow, the same as I did in the last test, and going over those images. And it does not really have an effect on the Archival ink, which it shouldn't, because our Archival ink should be waterproof. But it does wick out the ink a little bit in the on the pigment area, which it really shouldn't. The pigment ink should be waterproof, but it does look like it affects that. So I might not have let it have dry enough. But as you can see, when I do put the water on it, it does not affect it. And that is one of the properties of both the pigment and Archival inks, is that water is not going to affect it. It should be waterproof, basically, in essence, which is why you'll see a lot of mixed media people that are doing mixed media projects use the Archival ink, because you can put it down and then put water on top of it or other liquid mediums, and it stands up very well. And say I would, for my test, I would say I for myself, I would not use an alcohol marker with a pigment ink, but it looks to be okay with an Archival ink. And I just stamped these out on a piece of black cardstock as well, so that you can kind of see. You can kind of see in this picture that the dye inks are not as visible, and that is because the dye ink is sinking into the paper and the pigment ink is sitting on top of the paper. So you can kind of, hopefully you can see that there are two images that I stamped, or actually there's three. And when the paper's flat on the surface, you cannot really see that images at all, but you can see the pigment ink images. And I did the pigment ink in a purple, and then I did a yellow to see if that yellow would show up, which it didn't really. It just changed the color of the black coming through a little bit. And then of course the hybrid ink, which is the Distress Oxide, did very well, because these are supposed to do very well on dark colored cardstock. So on the back I have the StazOn, and I have the StazOn Opaque, and then I think that was a purple, so it turned into kind of a red. And then I wanted to show the difference between the Versamark. I don't know that I can see a huge difference when I'm actually using the Dazzles compared to the regular, but stamped out you can kind of see the Versamark watermark just looks black, and the dazzle does have a little bit of a silver kind of sparkle effect as compared to the normal Versamark. And Versamark is a great ink also for doing watermark. I'm just going to go over the archival inks really quickly. I don't have that many, but properties of archival inks are they are not good for alcohol markers. And to be an archival ink or considered archival, they must be fade resistant and permanent. So basically, if you have a project that you want to stand the test of time, or you have a project that's going to be hit by the sun a lot, archival ink would probably be the best ink to use in those cases. An ink that I didn't mention in the video is StazOn. It's a solvent ink. I have a few, but I don't really like using the ink. It has a slight odor to it, which, I mean, it's not horrible. I just prefer to use other inks. However, the information I found on StazOn, it's not suitable for alcohol markers, and it's probably used most often on glossy surfaces or non-porous surfaces, just because of the properties. It needs its own cleaner. It is very hard to get off of stamps unless you have the StazOn cleaner. And I have found for me that if I'm going to stamp on a glossy surface and I don't want it to smear, I just make sure, for example, if I'm using, if I'm stamping on something like Yupo, I don't use Yupo. I use the white or opaque craft plastic because it withstands heat a lot better than Yupo does. And I also use a heat resistant acetate, and I will also use a heavier thickness or a heavier weight of vellum, and then heat emboss that. I've found that for me that works the best instead of buying another ink with another range of colors. That is what I have chosen to do. Other than that, I also wanted to mention that the pricing on the spreadsheet is pricing that is the suggested price. So it's probably a higher price than what you might end up paying. It just depends. There are sales all the time, and so I encourage you to shop around if you are in the market for a new ink line. And of course, let's see. I also wanted to mention that the Colorbox brand is not included on my spreadsheet. So Colorbox is by ClearSnap. They had a huge amount of inks under their brand, and I was at Michael's the other day, and I know that they still have that in the stores, but through my research, I have found that Colorbox is no longer in business, and if you try and go to their website, it is actually not even up anymore. So I don't think they are producing those anymore or selling those anymore. However, you will notice that if you've seen the Stamp Market inks, which came out probably about a month and a half ago, maybe, excuse me, that their inks are by the Colorbox, and I'm sure that has something to do with when a company develops a line of inks, it sometimes can take a year, just depending on the whole process. It sounds like it's a lengthy process, so they were probably already developing this line for the Stamp Market at the time that they closed down, which was, I believe it was in July. The end of July was the when the business closed. So I just wanted to go ahead and mention that. I also want to mention that I did try and reach out to the Stamp Market. I emailed them to ask if they could clarify that information, and they didn't get back to me. So I did try to find out more information on that. But I hope this video helps you and tries and clears up some of the confusion. I know for me, I'm really happy that I did it because it has definitely cleared up any confusion I had, especially regarding what inks to use with alcohol markers. The only confusion there might still be is the hybrid inks. So if you're going to purchase a hybrid ink, you just have to check that brand and see whether or not they are going to be good for alcohol inks or water, because they are hybrids. It varies depending on brand and their formulation on how they're going to react. Some of them I think I mentioned this earlier, but some of them are good for alcohol inks and not with water. Some of them are good with both. Some of them are good with one or the other. So if you're going to be purchasing those and you're looking for something specific, I would go ahead and just kind of research the brand a little bit or the ink and find out what is important to you and what you want to buy. Other than that, thank you so much for joining me. As always, if you like this video or found it informative, please go ahead and give me a thumbs up. If you would like to subscribe to my channel, please click on that red subscribe button. I would love to have you. And thanks again for joining me, and I'll catch you next time.